So this is picking up after the first exam, so this is the first stuff that's on the second exam. I'm looking for something kind of behind the scenes here. There we go. What it says is never roll clay to get along thing. That's what he's doing. He says, God makes the snake. Because, boy, these things are a cinch. It does turn out that that shape is extremely common. A lot of places where the animals are not really related to one another. And in fact, biblically, what we translate as snake very often wasn't what we would consider a snake today. It could have been an eel, it could have been a roundworm, which is what we're about to talk about. Your handout, the first handout for the second exam is about roundworms, and it does talk about descriptions of roundworm parasites that were described in the biblical translations as serpents. Because what did they know? You know, long, skinny, they figured anything that worked the same way or was shaped the same way were related to one another. It made perfect sense. It's just eventually when people started cutting into them and looking inside, went, wow, these really aren't put together at all the same way. Then they started to differentiate between snakes and worms and all this other stuff. Just as a reminder, I'm not getting a tremendous number of calls, but I am getting a lot of emails. And the emails don't have to come on this particular rhythm, but you may not get a reply until this particular rhythm, although I tend to be in earlier than these numbers. And of course, that's, you know, I've got to call school in order to give it that extension. So these are roundworms, also known as nematodes. If you go far enough south, they're known as nematodes. Flukes are actually called trematodes, so you know there's some similarities here. And they are long and kind of shaped like a pen. And they are everywhere. Most species of roundworms are tiny. You might be able to see them, but they're pretty doggone tiny. But they are important in soil. They're not earthworms, but they live in the soil also. But the ones that live in the soil, most places are much smaller than earthworms. In Australia, they get actually pretty big. They live in the sediments of ponds and lakes and oceans and such. They also live in living things. So they tend to live in any living thing probably this size or bigger. So that's an awful lot of living things. That includes all the insects and the spiders and the little crawly things. Pretty much every species of living thing this big or bigger, and that includes the plants as well. Not the funguses so much, but the animals and the plants. Each species of living thing that size or bigger has at least one species of roundworm that is specifically living in that species of animal or plant. We've got 8 or 9 species of roundworms that are particular to people. Or if you go around the world and look in different places, you'll find roundworm parasites particular to people, a bunch of places. And then there's roundworm parasites that are in several species at the same time. We'll talk about a couple of those. This happens to be the group that I did most of my research on. So I have lots of stories, and I'm kind of fascinated with roundworm parasites. So you're going to hear my stories, and you're going to hear a few examples, and you're going to feel, a little queasy after you hear these. What happens in human biology, happens in medical school, happens all over the place, is you sit in class and you listen to some sort of condition or you hear about some sort of parasite, and then you start to think, ooh, wow, I think I have those. Even though you don't really, but it's a very, very common response. So we're going to go through a few examples. We'll start with Ascaris walking away to grab a bottle of them. These are preserved Ascaris. They kind of looks like a bottle full of earthworms. If I opened it up, they'd be much whiter than earthworms, but they're about the same shape and size as a good-sized nightcrawler. If your dog has Ascaris, it's a different species. Is that the Ascaris that people have it doesn't live in dogs, and a dog one doesn't live in people. But if your dog has Ascaris, your vet is in the habit of calling it your dog's got roundworms. Even though there's several different other roundworms your dog could have, for some reason I don't quite understand, Ascaris has become the roundworm when veterinarians refer to your dog got roundworms. They are not as nasty in dogs as our particular type of Ascaris is in people. So you're taking notes, right? Because I'm going to talk a lot, but I'm not going to write a lot down here. And to stay up and then be able to look later and know the stories, it's good to be able to scribble notes down. You're watching the videos and taking notes, right? Anyway, Ascaris lives in the intestine, in the space, and can build up, it's a pretty big worm, can build up a population to actually jam the intestines up. But they don't do that very often. They tend to spread out. You got 8 or 9 feet of intestine in these roundworms, maybe a foot long. And they reproduce, and the females lay eggs, and the eggs pass out the back end of you. In the environment, in environments that are warm and dry, Ascaris eggs can last in the dirt for years. And all you have to do is just get dirt on your hands with eggs in it, and get the eggs into your mouth, get the dirt into your mouth, and they hatch in your intestine and become Ascaris. The females are a little bit bigger. They run maybe as long as a foot, maybe about as big around, a little bit thinner than my pen, but close. And the males are a little bit shorter than that, and the males, their tail has a hook to it, almost like an old-fashioned umbrella handle. The female's opening to her reproductive system is about halfway along the female, so about midway along the worm is an opening. The male's penis extrudes inside that hook. Now keep in mind, very rarely when a roundworm gets into an intestine have they brought any kind of lighting apparatus with them. It's dark in there. They do not see, they feel for things. And when the female gets ready to mate, she starts feeling around for that hook, trying to find a male. And what she will do if there is a male is that she will crawl into that opening and line her opening up with where his penis will come out, called a cirrus in a worm. And they mate, and then she lays eggs, and the eggs pass out. Sometimes you get a female, full adult female, ready to mate. There's no males in there, but she's going to try to find them. There's openings into your intestines that come down from your liver and your pancreas that kind of feel like the hook of a male. They may try to get up in there and get themselves caught, jam themselves up. So the digestive enzymes from your pancreas, the bile from your liver, none of that can get into your intestines, and your digestion is really thrown off. They also sometimes will wander. They're good-sized, pretty strong worms. They can push their way through the valves that seal off one part of your digestive system from the other, push their way up through your stomach. If you go for a search on the internet for Ascaris, you'll find some pretty scary pictures of these things hanging out of people's noses. Is that we used to have, in my lab, we used to have an Ascaris that had come out of a diaper of an 18-month-old child who actually, over the course of figuring out what was going on, passed 3 of them. Good-sized worms. It had gone, that female had gone the other way, and it pushed its way into the diaper going, any guys out here? And there weren't. But there was a very upset lady at the naval station in Memphis. I did my graduate work in Memphis. And she went to the base doctor, and he looked and went, it's a worm. Let's send it over to the university. So it came over to where my lab was. And it's like, oh yeah, that's Ascaris. Where have you guys been? Ascaris is unusual in this country. It's not unknown, but it's unusual. More likely you picked it up somewhere where it's more common. And they had been in the Philippines. The family, the mother and the officer and the kid had been in the Philippines. Kid had crawled around on the dirt, got dirt in its mouth, wound up with some Ascaris. If you do have a bunch of them, it gets very dangerous to treat for them. Is you can give somebody the chemical to kill the worms, but if you've got a bunch of them, they die, and then they're just kind of being pushed along, and they can jam up going around the corners of your intestine and not move. And then nothing can get past them until you surgically open somebody up and cut their intestine open and pull the worms out, the dead worms, and discard them. So that's a fun type of worm. Hookworms. We've got some hookworms in the lab, the disease organisms lab. These are not huge. They run maybe an inch long. They're very thin. They're called hookworms because if you look in their mouth, they have these 4 hooked teeth in their mouths. Now, the hookworm species, there are hookworms in dogs and cats. They don't infect people. Our hookworms don't infect dogs and cats. Dog and cat hookworms, sometimes the dog hookworm will live in cats and the cat hookworm will live in dogs. But they don't cross over to people. Our digestive systems are too different. And they get in a little bit differently in cats and dogs. The hookworm species found in the United States used to be called Necator americanus, Latin for American killer. This was not a friendly hookworm. This is what hookworms do. They live in your digestive system, but they don't live off of the food in there, which is a very weird thing. If you live in a digestive system full of food, you would think they would eat the food. But they don't. They bite into the lining, make themselves a hole, and draw blood through them. Now, blood is not a great source of nutrition. It's very dilute, and you gotta process a decent amount of blood in order to get, decent nutrition out of it if you're a hookworm. So, decent amount of blood goes through them. It changes the color of the feces. It can make people anemic if you get a whole bunch of them. What's really more dangerous is that they'll hang on for a while, and then they'll come loose and bite somewhere else, but they leave a wound that bacteria and stuff can get out of your intestine and into your blood. That can be really dangerous. You can get, blood infections and other kinds of nastiness, and that can really kill you. This used to be a major problem in the American South on plantations. So the hookworms are in there, they're laying eggs, the eggs go out your back end. These eggs hatch out in the wide, wide world. Warm, wet conditions, like you get down south and around here in the summertime, but you don't get them around here. The eggs hatch and the larvae go through a couple of stages out in the environment, but they're still very, very tiny. But when it gets nice and wet, they will get up and they'll be on the surface of the soil. So tiny you'd need really good eyes to see them. You wouldn't even notice them. But back in the old days, people working the fields, when they needed to do their business, they would just go off the field and do a squat and do their business. And so the soil would get contaminated with these larvae. And they could come in through your skin. Not the really thick stuff on the bottom of your feet, but the arch of your foot. If you sat down, they could come in through the skin of your thighs. And once they were inside you, they would migrate to your lungs, emerge in your lungs. There's some symptoms that go with that if you picked up a bunch of them all at once. Migrate up from your lungs, get into your throat, and you swallow them. That's how they get into your digestive system. And then they hook onto the side, drink blood. Very often give people a craving to eat dirt, which is another way to get more hookworms into you. Weird thing. In dogs and cats, they can't really get in through the soil, through the dirt, the skin on the paws. So they tend to just kind of get it up along the sides and wait to get licked off. That's how they get into the digestive system of dogs and cats. And as I said, not quite as dangerous in dogs and cats as they are in people. Not entirely sure why. I have to look that up. But that's the second type of roundworm. When they figured out how these worked, Alabama and Mississippi put together a huge public health campaign. They built restrooms, basically, set up running water and drainage for sewer and stuff so that people were not recontaminating themselves by going in the fields or going off to the sides of the fields because it was expensive. Is that the workers were dying, they weren't being treated real great. Even after the Civil War, slavery technically went away, but the system was still pretty intact. But they didn't want the workers dying, so they threw a whole bunch of money into clearing these guys out and did a pretty good job of it. Didn't do a great job of helping the workers in other ways, but they helped them that way. Now, if you're my age, this is not a friendly word. This is a pejorative people, excuse me, used to use for folks who are Italian and Greek. Not quite as up to the nasty level of the N word, but not a friendly thing. But it actually did refer to the area around the Mediterranean. So this word got connected to them, but it also had originally been connected to the Mediterranean, where these worms are from. And they are described in the Bible. Your handout will talk about that. This is a very interesting adaptation. To get from person to person when you live in very, very dry, like desert-like conditions, and that's common in areas around the Mediterranean, think of Egypt, think of the Middle East, then passing in just fecal material doesn't really give you a route into the next person. It's just, you do your business, it dries out there, and the dryness will kill just about anything. These guys do something a little bit different. You pick them up in drinking water. The larvae are in these tiny little crustaceans, about the size of the things we looked at in the microscope lab. Very, very tiny little crustacean guys. And you drink the water, you get the crustaceans, you digest the crustaceans. The worms resist digestion, and they migrate out of your intestines into the lining inside your abdomen, and they grow there. Females, if you've ever taken a pen apart, like a flick pen, the little thing that holds the ink is about as big around as these worms get. And they get a little bit longer than that, maybe a foot long. When the female is ready to lay her eggs, she does not just lay eggs into your digestive system, because they would pass out and they would die. So what she does is she migrates away from your abdominal cavity in the connective tissue that holds your skin down. Somewhat loose, she's strong, she can push her way through it. It's painful, your immune system goes nuts about it, you get inflammation, your skin gets all red, you can see her underneath the surface if she's big enough and close enough to the surface. And so the Bible described them as fiery serpents, because it makes you feel like you're on fire while she's migrating. She's going south. Why is she going south? She's going to get far enough down that the next time you go to get your drinking water, which almost always involved walking into the water and dipping your containers and walking back out, she's sensitive to that change of temperature when the leg gets wet. And when the leg gets wet, she sticks her little egg-laying butt out of the skin and starts laying eggs into the water. The eggs will hatch there, the larvae will come out, get picked up by these crustaceans, and the next person will drink the crustaceans and get more worms. But the condition itself is very painful. But it used to be treatable. Even 2,000-3,000 years ago, it used to be a treatable condition. You'd go to your local doctor, who would have his little symbol up, and he'd go, oh, okay, I know what these are. And what he had was a stick with a notch in it, and a little crossbar. And so he throws some water where he could see the worm under the surface. He throws some water on your skin, and when she stuck her little wormy butt out, he would catch her on the notch, and then because of that crossbar, he could wind her up on his little device to get the worm out of you. Sometimes he could get her all at once, sometimes he could get just so far and it would get too tight and he'd go, I don't want to break it. That turns out to be a bad thing. Come back in a couple of days and you'd be walking around with this thing hanging off of you. And then, the worm, that's usually not good for the worm. She would dry out and die, and then he could wind her the rest of the way out. This became the symbol of doctors. So, the stick with a crossbar, and then it would wind these worms up. Now, people didn't know, right? Worms, snakes, eels, all people figured they were related. Even a worm that was too tiny to really see the details of, they figured they were tiny snakes. And so when they drew this, they would generally draw this as a snake wrapped around the pole. And sometimes they'd get fancy. There'd be two snakes. They often put wings on it because this became the symbol of medicine, and Hermes, the flying god with the wings on his ankles, was the symbol of that, so they put wings on it. But this is the medical symbol. This is what they call a caduceus. This is what he hung outside his house just to let you know he was a doctor. And it just became associated with doctors long after, you never ran into these worms. These worms are pretty much under control. Is that the nice thing about controlling these worms is that instead of picking up the larvae directly, which are very small, they come in these crustaceans. And what's happened where the worms have been common is people get in the habit of, they bring the water home and they pour it through cloth into another container. And the crustaceans are caught in the cloth, it's like a filter. And then you just hang the cloth out and it dries out, the crustaceans die and the worms die, and you can use the cloth again. And it's been very effective. In fact, you've got a handout about getting these guys under control. But the fact that they're the original doctor symbol is kind of a cool thing. So we're not all the way through the roundworms, but this is a long enough video right now that I'm going to stop it and pick it up later.